Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. Today we are going to be painting Rotigus. I'll also be doing a quick unboxing, it seems. I'm using a little knife to cut through the plastic, opening it up. It's a pretty straightforward kit. A lot of large abstract pieces. Gonna have to do a lot of dry fitting to make sure this works well. Then once the pieces are cut, I then take a razor knife and I'm going to use this to remove the excess flesh and grind off any excess lines that are on mold lines that are on the model. I will use super glue to attach the model together, but I do recommend doing a lot of dry fitting beforehand because the pieces look very strange. I also want to highlight, this box came with these really excellent Nurgling characters. Alright, with it fully assembled, I somewhat kind of poorly put it together. There are some gaps, so I'm going to go with some Liquitex modeling putty, and I'm going to use this to fill the gaps. I'm going to use an excess amount because it shrinks a little bit, but I need something better than Liquitex for this. Maybe someday I'll find a good tool for it. And now with general purpose gray bright touch primer, car primer, I then spray and prime the whole model. I actually have to take a few attempts because there's some places it's hard to get into just with this huge model. And now with Wraithbone and Skeleton Horde contrast, we're going to start with the skin of the model. I'm going to start off with airbrushing Wraithbone all over the model. And once that's done, we're going to take Skeleton Horde contrast in a big brush and we're going to apply it all over the model. We've got to make sure it doesn't pull too heavily in certain areas. We just want it to cover over and pull only a little bit in the cracks. And now going back to Wraithbone, we're going to dry brush the entirety of all his skin. This takes a while and I have to vary between the big brush and a smaller dry brush for certain areas it's hard to reach into. And now with Pallid Witch Flesh, Doombull Brown, Lamian Medium, Plague Bearer's Flesh, Biltan Green, and Drakenhof Nightshade, we're going to do the next layer of coating on the skin. We're going to start off with Pallid Witch Flesh, and what we're going to do is we're going to draw straight lines on all the folds of his flesh, on the top parts of his flesh that fold. This is going to take a while. We're just drawing straight lines. This is going to add more focus and detail into the model and make his skin look smoother, as well as basically do a very good highlight on all the folds of flesh. And once that's done, we're going to take the Doombull Brown and we're going to, with a thin tiny brush, we're going to paint directly into the recesses of his flesh to add more contrast in it. Now, however, It only a few of the fat folds needed this, so I overdid it a little bit in some places. There are some big giant folds that could do with this, but for the most part you can actually kind of skip this step a little. And now with Plague Bear's flesh loaded up into the airbrush, we're going to spray where all the flesh is ripped and torn. We're then going to take a 1-to-1 mix of Biel-Tan Green and Drakenhof Nightshade with a little bit of water mixed in and apply it to the part of the skin that is torn and ripped. Now what we're going to do is we're going to apply it all over, and then we're going to try to make sure it doesn't pull into the recesses too much. We're going for skin coloration, not for a deep pulling. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go back and we're going to do a second coat of this because it's just a little too thin. Now with Lamian Medium and Serif Cepheum, which is a more lighter color than Skeleton Horde Contrast, we're going to mix them in 1-to-1 with a little bit of water, and we're going to airbrush this all over the model. This is going to be our final layer of covering. It's going to tone down a lot of the greens and blues and tie everything together. Better to have it thinner because less is, it's easier to do a second coat than to have done too much and then you can't undo it. Now with Biel-Tan Green, Drakenhof Nightshade, and Pallid Witch Flesh, we're going to paint a couple things. First, we're going to start off with Pallid Witch Flesh, and we're going to paint all the tentacles, the small ones coming out of his body, and the giant ones coming out of his left arm. And then with Biel-Tan Green, we're going to apply this all over every one of his boils and stuff scattered throughout his body. And then with some watered down Biel-Tan Green, watered down with water, we are then going to apply this onto all the tentacles coming out, especially the giant ones. And now with Drakenhof Nightshade, watered down a little bit, we're going to apply on the big tentacles a bunch of layers. We're going to apply not towards the tip, but like 75% of the tentacle and back. And then we're going to do a further layering again, a second layer, about halfway through the tentacles and back. And then we're going to do a third layer towards like the last quarter of the tentacles coming out of the body. And we're going to do multiple layers onto the other tentacles that are coming out of the body as well, at like 75%, 50%, and 25%, as best we can, because some of them are very tiny, so it's hard to like get it right. And then once that is done, finally, with the Drakenhof Nightshade, we're going to apply a watered down bit onto the edges of the ripped open flesh to add some more color and finality in it. And now with Skeleton Horde Contrast, I'm going to apply a single layer onto each of his nails, his toenails, fingernails, like that. I'm just going to make sure it doesn't pull too hard, because with all the stuff we've done beforehand, it just needs to be yellowed a bit with Skeleton Horde. And now with Pallid Witch Flesh, White Scar, Agrax Earthshade, Skeleton Horde Contrast, and Plague Bearer's Flesh, we're going to paint his stick. We're going to start off with a layer of Pallid Witch Flesh all throughout the wood. I'll then dry brush / overbrush White Scar White all over the wood. And once that dries, we will take Agrax Earthshade and we will apply it all throughout the wood stick. This is going to make the deepest, darkest recesses in the model, or in the stick. And once that is done, we're then going to take Skeleton Horde Contrast and apply it all over the stick. However, I made a mistake in this. There are certain parts that are going to end up being green colored, and I would have only put Skeleton Horde Contrast on the parts that are not supposed to be green. So I darkened it a little too much and that caused some trouble later. I then go with Biltan Green and then apply it onto certain parts of the sticks, the tips and a few other parts around the handle to make it green, but maybe what I should have done is mix this with Plague Bearer's Flesh to give it like an olive dark green look instead. I then take Moot Green and then I do a mix of dry brushing, overbrushing, and then layer painting onto the tips of the gnarl rod that are supposed to be green. Looking back, what I should have done is after the Skeleton Horde Contrast, do another layer of White Scar White to whiten these tips and edges, and then just use a simple wash, but I darkened it too much, and this is me trying to save it, and it doesn't look that good in the end. And now with Pallid Witch Flesh, Magos Purple, Carrionburg Crimson, Cadian Fleshtone, and Kislev Flesh, we're going to be painting the ripped flesh. We're going to start off with Pallid Witch Flesh, and we're going to apply this all over the inside of his mouths and on the flesh area stuff that's out. We'll then use about 2 layers of Magos Purple on the mouths, the inside of the mouth, on his belly, on his arm, and in his own mouth. Now I go to Carrionburg Crimson because I never really used it before and it was recommended by the manual, and so I try it out here, but it doesn't look good. So in the end I do 2 coats of Carrionburg Crimson, but what I should have done is after doing the Pallid Witch Flesh, go straight to Cadian Fleshtone. The Pallid Witch Flesh was a base, and just cover everything with Cadian Fleshtone and then apply 1 to 2 layers of Crimsonburg, because otherwise it just didn't look too good at all. I then take Cadian Fleshtone and a dry brush, and I dry brush directly into the open cuts and sores and everything else here. This, I don't know, I give up on it. It just doesn't seem to cut it, and so I don't bother going to the Kislev Flesh. I just don't like how this thing turned out, so I think I'm going to be able to salvage it later. And now with Genestealer Purple, Corn Red, Nuln Oil, and Pallid Witch Flesh, we're going to be painting his hat. Now we're going to do a 1-to-1 mix of Gene Stealer Purple and Corn Red. Now I mix a lot of it because I'm going to be using this as a base mix. I'm going to be mixing more and more Pallid Witch Flesh in for lighter stuff. So with a 1-to-1 mix of Gene Stealer Purple and Corn Red, we're going to paint his entire hat this color. And then we're going to apply Nuln Oil all over the hat. We want it to pull, but not too much. We want it to show the depths and the recesses, but we don't want a lake of it. We're then going to go back to the Gene Stealer Purple and Corn Red mix, and we're going to highlight all of the hat. We're going to basically paint like 80 to 90% of the entire hat this color again. And we're going to be using straight lines mostly on all these edges and folds. We will now mix in some Pallid Witch Flesh into our Corn Red and Gene Stealer Purple mix, making it even brighter. And what we're going to do is we're going to apply this as a highlight. We're going to cover basically maybe 60 to 70% of the hat with this. What we're going to do is we're going to paint a straight line, and then we're going to do a feathering technique of just pressing and dragging it back to create like a cloth-like texture coming in and out. We're going to do it light. As you can see here, I basically draw a straight line on the edge of the folds, and then I do a bunch of slashes or tap 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 taps, depending on how big that fold is, and it creates this cloth-like look and appearance. I then take more Pallid Witch Flesh and mix it in until it's a bright pink, and then I draw very thin lines along the most highest raised areas, and then I do either tap 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 taps if it's a very thin fold, or I just draw straight lines right across. So draw one straight line across the entire fold, and then draw lines through it. And that is a sweet looking hat, a lot of nice detail. So one thing I was able to do to get consistent like paint control is, well, first after like mixing all the paint and stuff, I would then wash the brush entirely to clear it of all paint, and then I would dip the very tip of the brush in the paint, and then if it was too watery or whatever, I would then touch a paper towel with the tip of the brush so all the excess paint flows out, and then I have just the right amount to just apply taps or just draw straight lines here and there. So that's how I got good paint control. And now with Eshin Grey, Nuln Oil, Dawnstone, and Pallid Witch Flesh, we're going to be painting the horns on his head. We're going to start off with a base layer of Eshin Grey. And once that is done, we will apply a layer of Nuln Oil to add more depth. And once that is done, we're going to take Eshin Grey and we're going to, I start trying to dry brush it, but it's not good enough, so then I just do over brushing to pick out all the details in the high raised areas. I then start getting pure Dawnstone, and then I dry brush it / over brush it over. I just want straight clean lines. We don't want the dirtiness of dry brushing, so I ended up just going with some over brushing on the edges to make it appear clearer. And then with pure Pallid Witch Flesh, I try dry brushing or over brushing over it, and it just doesn't look good. So what I do is I eventually switch to using just a straight brush, and I just paint the straight lines on it, and it's okay, it's serviceable. I shouldn't have overbrushed the last step. It kind of ruins it a little. And now with Mournfang Brown, Agrax Earthshade, and XV88, I'm going to start painting the flap on his back. Now, because I did so well with his hat, I'm going to try to mimic that right here. So we're going to start off with a base layer of Mournfang Brown all over. And then when that dries, we're going to apply a thin layer of Agrax Earthshade onto it. And then when that dries, we're going to take Mournfang Brown and we're going to highlight like 90% of it, all the edges and stuff. And we'll be continuing the technique of drawing a straight line and then doing feathering strokes along it, along the edges of the cloth and along the folds of the cloth. And then we're going to do a 1-to-1 mix of XV88 and Mornfang Brown, and we're going to continue highlighting further. We're going to do like maybe 10 to 20%, maybe 30% of the folds with this, or of the cloth with this. We're going to draw first a straight line, and then we're going to do the feathery strokes up and down all throughout it. We're going to do crisscrosses here and there on certain areas, the wide areas, to add some more texture to it. And then with pure XV88, we're going to do like 5 to 10% of this cloth model. So what we're going to do is we're going to draw a very thin line with very controlled brush strokes, and then we will do the feathering throughout the line. So we draw one line horizontal, and then we draw a bunch of small lines vertically all throughout it. And this creates the cloth-like texture pattern. And while we're at it, I take the pure XV88 and paint the ropes that are holding all these bells and stuff all throughout his body, and mostly his stick. And now with Wraithbone and Serif Cepheum, which was a mistake, I should have done Skeleton Horde Contrast instead. I wanted to try something different. But with Wraithbone, we're going to paint all the maggots. The huge amount of maggots in his body. We're going to ignore all the maggots that are inside the giant cuts, because we're not really going to be able to see them later, and they're going to be a hassle to do. So the maggots on his face, on his gnarl rod, on his hands, and spread out in a few areas on his body. And then we add the Serif Cepheum onto the maggots. Now the problem is it's just not that dark enough and striking enough so that the maggots just look like just bland little bubbles. In comparison to everything else where there's a lot of detail and shading and stuff, this overall looks like a failure. I then try to redeem it with Agrax Earthshade to add like a dark, very dark brown onto the maggots, and so I take this and apply it on all the maggots on his mouth and that are scattered around. But it's not good enough. I then go back with Wraithbone and I try to highlight all the maggots, like their spine, the very edge, the highest spine ridge on each of these maggots, and as well as the ones on his mouth, but I try to overbrush the ones in his mouth, but it's not as good. Now with Zandry Dust and Skeleton Horde Contrast, we're going to paint the teeth that are scattered throughout him. He has 3 mouths, 3 sets of teeth. We're going to start off with a base layer of Zandry Dust on all of them. Then we're going to take Skeleton Horde Contrast and apply it all over these teeth. And once that dries, we're going to take pure Zandry Dust and draw straight lines with our brush along the higher raised edges of each teeth. I then decide these are too bland as they are, so then I take Wraithbone and I do a 1-to-1 mix with Wraithbone and Zandry Dust, and I highlight the teeth further by drawing straight lines from like 75% of the tooth up to its tip and have them meet in the middle. I then take pure Wraithbone and then apply it to the last 25% to 10% of each of these teeth. Now the big mouth on the bottom is the easiest to paint, and his regular mouth is the hardest to paint because the teeth are so small there. And now with Nuln Oil, Eshin Grey, and Dawnstone, we're going to paint the little eye that's on his hand. We're going to start with a base layer of Eshin Grey. And then once that dries, we're going to apply Nuln Oil. And once that dries, we're going to apply Eshin Grey to 99% of it. We just want that black outline between the eye and the rest of his flesh. And then we're going to go to pure Dawnstone and then fill out most of his eye, like 90% of it. I then decide to take some Pallid Witch Flesh and mix it 1-to-1 with Dawnstone and then apply it to the center of his eye to highlight it further and make it more like a focal point. And now with Moot Green, Beeltan Green, and Pallid Witch Flesh, I'm going to paint the eye he has. And I'm going to start off with a base layer of Moot Green all over his eye, his left eye. However, it looks good enough and shaded enough already that I don't really need to use the Beeltan Green, so I mix a 1-to-1 mix of Moot Green and Pallid Witch Flesh and then cover like 80 to 90% of his eye in it. And then finally I take pure Pallid Witch Flesh and then I apply it to like a center dot of his eye to make a good focal point. And now with Agrax Earthshade, we're going to fix his face. Essentially, there needs to be a little bit more depth on his face because it just lacks, it lacks detail. And so instead of repainting everything, I'm just going to take Agrax Earthshade and apply it onto inside his nose, a few layers in his nose to make sure it's full, alongside the ridges of his face and cheeks, his bottom lip between his teeth and the flesh, and just some certain areas just to add some depth and add some more definition into his face. Now with AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish and the Army Painter paints Anti-Shine Matte Varnish, it's a shiny, glossy kind of thing. We're going to apply this all over the model. We're going to start with AK Interactive and we're going to airbrush the entire model with this. This is going to make the cloth look more cloth-like and the dead flesh more flesh-like. I then take the Anti-Shine Matte Varnish because it has a nice glossy look, and I apply it to the tentacles to make them look glossy. However, shortly after doing this, I then realized that I could have just used gloss varnish, and this anti-matte shine varnish is much more expensive than the giant bucket of gloss varnish I have. So I swap over. I then use the gloss varnish to apply it into the open mouths, some maggots, basically his 3 mouths and the rest of the tentacles. Now with Balthazar Gold Brass Scorpion, we're going to paint the brass talismans that are hanging around and the brass bell that he has. So with Balthazar Gold as a base color, we're going to apply this to the little talismans and like the few bells he has on his sides. And then we're going to take Brass Scorpion and we're going to dry brush this onto the brass things. It's going to make it shine very nicely. And now with Lead Belcher, Nuln Oil, Riser Rust, and this oxide color, we're going to paint the chainmail that's off his back. We're going to start off with a layer of Lead Belcher all over. And then once that dries, we're going to take Nuln Oil and apply it everywhere. And once that is dried, we're going to take Lead Belcher and dry brush over the metal to add the shine again. And once that dries, we're going to be a bit artistic and we're going to start applying some Riser Rust in random patches. We're going to just like tap 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 a bit and then just brush up and down to spread it a bit. And then once that's done, we're going to apply the oxide color into random batches here and there. But don't forget, we're also going to be doing these metal buttons that are on the cloth on his back, as well as these metal buttons that are also on the hat, attaching it to his head. And now with Blood for the Blood God, which is the ultimate patchwork for mistakes, I'm going to take this and I'm going to apply this into all of his ripped flesh cuts. Now, I don't want to like just slap in a ton of it and just cover everything. I want to apply a thin layer, a layer that's thin enough that you can still see the under layer. And I'm going to apply this all over the ripped flesh. And now I'm going to do a final assembly. I'm going to super glue him to the base I've pre-made. I've also attached a 3D printed nameplate on there. Not my best work. I'm actually kind of rusty on the 3D printing stuff. It's been a while. But I will super glue him on, as well as a few Nurglings that I painted separately. Now with some yellow ink and Nurgle's Rot, I'm going to mix the two until the Nurgle's Rot is a bright yellow. And then I'm going to apply this on all the boils all throughout Rotigus' body, as well as just some areas to clean up in case of any mistakes or paint dripped in the wrong places and such and such. And done. Now, this was a pretty interesting mix of things. Now, the first Great and Clean one I painted, I bought off eBay and he was completely assembled, so he didn't have these really nice little Nurglings with him, so I missed out on that. But as well, this Rotigus was a mixed bag of a lot of different things. His skin, his open sores, his face, his hat, and his staff, and his left arm, they're all varying degrees of success. So overall, honestly, there are some things that really bring this model up in quality, and there's some things that really brought it down. Like for instance, the staff, I did terrible on the staff. Like his gnarl rod, it just didn't really pan out that well compared to others, as well as the maggots coming out of his mouth. I mean, they look too gelatinous. They look underwhelming compared to a lot of other things, and so they dragged them all down. Also, the 3D printed name Rotigus, that did not come out well. It's been a while since I've actually made anything in a 3D printer, and I'm having some really weird issues with printing. I had to print this thing twice because for some reason half of my board, nothing can stick to it. I have no idea why, so failed prints all around. But so the staff, the maggots, and his nameplate kind of bring it down, but there are a lot of good successes. Like, look at his skin. It came in out smooth. There's a lot of detail. You can see the depth. You can see every single fold. So in very simple, easy fashion, you can see all the details on his body. It looks really good. His skin is great. The tears on his flesh look great. Now his hat looks amazing. His horns are not the best, but the hat, that really brings it up. And his face, apart from the maggots, is really well done. The flap on his back, really well done. It looks really good. The giant blue tentacles coming out, they look really good. The face on him looks really good. So there's a lot of things on this that look really, really good, but there are a few things that drag it down. So overall, the good outweighs the bad, and I'm going to say that I think this Rotigus is a good 8 out of 10, like straight up. I'm going to give my work here an 8 out of 10. The maggots, the gnarl rod, and my really bad returned 3D printing dragged it down. I mean, if it was just those, like those things are like a 6. This whole model could have been a 9 if I got those better. But, oh well. Alright then, more to come, so comment if you want to comment, like if you liked it, dislike if you disliked it, subscribe for more. More is coming, and the next video is going to be very interesting. I finally got my hands on something pretty good. So, see you then, bye.